The 320th was the only all-black combat unit to storm Omaha Beach on D-Day. Medic Waverly Woodson saved 200 men, yet for decades, history said he was never there. December 1942. Waverly Woodson was a pre-med student at Lincoln University in Pennsylvania when he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Pearl Harbor had happened a year earlier. The war was going badly. Young men were enlisting by the millions. Woodson, brilliant and driven, passed the examination to enter officer candidate school. He had the grades, he had the scores, he had everything required to become an officer in the United States Army, except the right skin color. "We can't make you an officer," the recruiter told him. Not in so many words. The Army had rules, unwritten rules. Black men could serve, but they couldn't lead white men. Black men could die for their country, but they couldn't give orders in it. So Waverly Woodson, who dreamed of becoming a doctor, became a medic instead. It was the closest the segregated Army would let him get to medicine. He was assigned to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, a unit so unique, so unusual, that most people today have never heard of it. The 320th was an all-black battalion with a mission that sounded like science fiction. They would deploy hydrogen-filled balloons, massive spheres tethered to steel cables, flying 200 feet above the battlefield. These weren't decorative. The cables were armed with small bombs. Any German plane that snagged a cable risked having its wings sheared off, or triggering an explosion that would tear the aircraft apart. The balloons forced enemy planes to fly higher, making their bombing and strafing runs less accurate, less deadly. It was critical work, dangerous work. The kind of work that required soldiers to land with the first assault waves, under the heaviest fire, to get those balloons in the air before the German Luftwaffe arrived. The Army formed 4 all-black barrage balloon battalions. Units 301 through 317 were white. Units 318 through 321 were black. Segregation extended even to experimental military technology. The 320th trained at Camp Tyson in Paris, Tennessee, the Jim Crow South, where black soldiers learned that they would face 2 enemies, the Nazis in Europe and the racism at home. In November 1943, the 320th shipped to England. 621 men preparing for an invasion they knew was coming, but couldn't predict. They trained in the English countryside. They prepared their balloons. They waited. The locals in England were different. British civilians didn't understand American segregation. They treated the black soldiers like human beings, invited them to their homes, served them in their pubs. The contrast was stark. The 320th discovered that they were more welcome in a foreign country at war than they were in their own homeland at peace. The men of the 320th would remember that. Remember what it felt like to be treated with dignity. When the war ended, many of them would return to America and join the civil rights movement, fighting for the same freedoms they'd experienced in Europe. But first, they had to survive June 6th. The night before D-Day, Waverly Woodson and his fellow medics didn't sleep. They checked their equipment: aid bags, morphine syringes, bandages, sulfur powder, plasma, the tools of battlefield medicine. 5 medics from the 320th would be in the first wave hitting Omaha Beach. They would be the first African Americans to set foot on Fortress Europe. The first black soldiers to storm the beaches of Normandy. Nobody told them they were part of history. They were just soldiers with a job to do. The landing craft carrying Woodson's team pushed through heavy seas in the pre-dawn darkness. Men vomited from seasickness. The English Channel was rough. The boats crowded, the air thick with fear and diesel fumes. As they approached the coast, they could see the cliffs of Normandy, could hear the thunder of naval bombardment, could feel the vibration of thousands of aircraft overhead. The plan was simple. The 320th would land mid-morning after the initial assault waves had secured the beach. They would deploy their balloons to protect the forces pouring ashore. By the time the German Luftwaffe arrived to bomb the beaches, a curtain of steel cables and armed balloons would be waiting. But nothing went as planned on D-Day. The early morning bombing runs had failed to knock out German defenses. The beach obstacles remained intact. The bunkers and machine gun nests were untouched. As the first waves of American infantry hit Omaha Beach, they ran into a meat grinder. German gunners, positioned in the cliffs above, had perfect firing positions. They could see everything. They could hit everything. Woodson's landing craft was supposed to land at 9 a.m., but somewhere in the chaotic approach to the beach, everything went wrong. A German 88mm gun found them. The shell exploded against the vessel, tearing through metal and flesh. The man standing next to Woodson died instantly. Woodson felt something hit him, burning, tearing. Shrapnel ripped into his buttocks and thigh. Blood soaked his uniform. For a moment he thought he was dying. A fellow medic slapped dressings on his wounds. Temporary, inadequate, but enough to keep him moving. The landing craft's engine was destroyed. They were dead in the water, drifting helplessly toward shore while German machine guns raked the waves around them. "The tide brought us in," Woodson would later recall, "and that's when the 80s hit us. They were murder. Of our 26 Navy personnel, there was only one left. They raked the whole top of the ship and killed all the crew. Then they started with the mortar shells." Woodson and 4 other medics crouched behind a tank and crawled toward Omaha Beach. They were the first African Americans to touch Normandy sand. There was no ceremony, no photographs, no recognition, just blood and smoke and the screams of wounded men. The beach was chaos, bodies floating in the surf, men pinned down behind obstacles, the wounded crying for help, medics being the most distinctive cry in any battle, the word that cuts through artillery fire and machine gun chatter. The desperate plea that medics hear in their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Medic. Woodson's training took over. Pain didn't matter. His own wounds didn't matter. He had a job to do. He found a relatively protected spot behind a seawall and set up an aid station. Not a hospital, not a proper medical facility, just a small area where he could work, where wounded men could be dragged or carried, where he could try to save lives in the middle of hell. For the next 30 hours, Corporal Waverly Woodson didn't stop. He removed bullets with his bare hands, set broken bones, splinted fractures, administered plasma and morphine, cleaned wounds with whatever he had available, applied sulfur powder to prevent infection, bandaged everything from minor cuts to catastrophic trauma. He worked while German snipers targeted anyone who moved, while mortar fire continued to fall, while machine guns swept the beach at irregular intervals. At one point, he performed an amputation. A soldier's foot was so badly damaged that it couldn't be saved. With limited tools, under fire, with his own wounds bleeding, Woodson amputated the foot. The soldier survived. During the height of the battle, the guide rope from one of the landing craft broke. 4 men were swept into the churning water, drowning under the weight of their equipment. Woodson left his aid station, waded into the ocean, and pulled them out one by one. 2 of them weren't breathing. He administered CPR, mouth-to-mouth, chest compressions. In the middle of the D-Day invasion, while German guns continued to fire, he saved them both. By the end of June 6th, Woodson had treated more than 200 men, 5 to 7% of all American casualties on Omaha Beach. One medic, 21 years old, working for 30 consecutive hours, with shrapnel in his body, without rest, without relief, without stopping. Finally, his body gave out. Blood loss, exhaustion, physical collapse. Other medics loaded him onto an evacuation truck with other wounded soldiers. Even then, he continued working. Men in the truck had nearly drowned on the approach to shore. Their lungs were full of water. Woodson administered rescue breathing while being evacuated, saved more lives on the ride to the hospital ship. The military newspaper Stars and Stripes wrote that Woodson and his fellow medics covered themselves with glory on D-Day. The black newspapers back in America hailed him as the #1 invasion hero. The Army issued a press release in August 1944, calling him a modest black American soldier who was cited by his commanding officer for extraordinary bravery. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, commended the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, saying they carried out their mission with courage and determination and proved an important element of the air defense team. Despite the chaos, the 320th accomplished their mission. By June 21st, 141 barrage balloons protected Omaha and Utah beaches. The Germans expected to devastate the Allied forces with air attacks. Instead, they flew into a steel curtain. Planes that snagged the cables crashed. Pilots were terrified of the balloons. The 320th had saved countless lives by forcing enemy aircraft to fly higher, making their attacks less accurate, less deadly. The battalion served for 140 days in France. They followed the Allied advance along the coast, protected the port of Cherbourg after it was liberated. 3 men from the 320th were killed in action. 17 were wounded, all of them black soldiers, serving in the only all-black combat unit on D-Day, in an army that considered them inherently inferior. Woodson's commanding officer recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. But someone in the chain of command looked at what Woodson had done and decided it wasn't enough. General John C. H. Lee's office upgraded the recommendation to the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor that America can bestow. In August 1944, a War Department aide named Phileo Nash wrote a memo to the Franklin Roosevelt White House, the memo that would be discovered 70 years later by journalist Linda Hervieux, buried in dusty boxes at the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library. Here is a black individual from Philadelphia who has been recommended for a suitable award, Nash wrote. This is a big enough award so that the president can give it personally, as he has in the case of some white boys. The Medal of Honor, the award Nash was describing, the honor Woodson had earned, the recognition that should have been automatic, but it never came. Woodson received a Bronze Star. Eventually, not immediately. Not with the fanfare that white Medal of Honor recipients received, just a Bronze Star, the 4th highest combat decoration. Respectable, but nowhere near what he had earned. Of the more than 400 Medals of Honor awarded during World War II, not a single one went to a black soldier. Not one. Out of 1.2 million African Americans who served, not one was considered worthy of America's highest honor. In October 1944, the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion was pulled out of France. Weather had turned bad. Ships couldn't land supplies anymore. The balloons were no longer needed. The unit returned to Camp Stewart, Georgia, to prepare for deployment to the Pacific Theater. They were welcomed home by white soldiers shouting slurs at them, reminded that they were back in America now, back where their heroism didn't matter as much as their skin color. The 320th eventually made it to Hawaii in May 1945. The war ended before they saw combat again. Woodson was recalled to active duty during the Korean War, though he never deployed overseas again. He left the service in 1952 as a staff sergeant. He married Joann in 1952. They had 3 children, built a life together. Woodson wanted to go to medical school. He'd always wanted to be a doctor. But in the 1950s, very few medical schools accepted black students. The GI Bill, which sent millions of white veterans to college, didn't mandate that schools desegregate or abandon discriminatory quotas. Black veterans faced limited choices. Woodson's dream of becoming a licensed physician died in a country that wouldn't educate him despite his service. Instead, he studied medical technology, worked at the Naval Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, and the National Institutes of Health for 28 years. In the black community of Clarksburg, Maryland, where few doctors would serve black patients, he became known as Doc Woodson. Neighbors brought their families to him. He performed medical checkups, gave advice, helped however he could, not as a licensed physician, but as a man with extensive medical training who refused to let bureaucracy stop him from helping people. Waverly Woodson never complained about the Medal of Honor, never publicly demanded recognition, never made his heroism the center of his identity. He considered what he'd done on D-Day to be his duty. Nothing more, nothing less. He'd been a soldier with a job, and he'd done it. In 1994, 50 years after D-Day, the French government invited Woodson and 2 other veterans of the 320th on an all-expenses-paid trip to Normandy. France presented them with medals commemorating their service. Woodson was the only black veteran in the group. The French remembered what America had forgotten. The French honored what America had erased. "I was the only black man of the 3, Woodson said proudly at the time. His widow Joann remembers that trip. "They were so gracious to us. I will always remember that." In 1997, President Bill Clinton awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 Black World War II veterans, 52 years late. 6 of them posthumously. The Army had commissioned a study in 1993 that proved what everyone already knew. Systematic racial discrimination had prevented black soldiers from receiving proper recognition during the war. Woodson was considered for the award. He was interviewed. Researchers knew his story, but there was a problem. His military records were gone. On July 12, 1973, a fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, Missouri, destroyed 16 to 18 million military personnel files. Woodson's file was among them. The documentation that would have supported his Medal of Honor recommendation. Gone, burned, lost forever. Without documentation, the Army said it couldn't move forward. The study's authors recommended Woodson, but the board reviewing the cases said there wasn't enough evidence. The fire that destroyed the records became the excuse to deny him again. So 7 black soldiers received the Medal of Honor in 1997. Waverly Woodson wasn't among them. He died on August 12, 2005, at the age of 83. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His marble tombstone listed his final rank, Staff Sergeant. His decorations, Purple Heart and Bronze Star. Not the Medal of Honor, not the recognition he deserved. But Joann Woodson didn't give up. In 2015, she reached out to Maryland Senator Chris Van Hollen's office. She told them her husband's story, showed them what documentation she had. Van Hollen took up the fight. Year after year, bill after bill, pushing the Army to reconsider, demanding justice. Journalist Linda Hervieux published her book Forgotten, The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes at Home and at War, in 2015. She had discovered that memo from 1944, the Filio Nash memo. Proof that Woodson had been recommended for the Medal of Honor. Proof that the recommendation had been elevated. Proof that something had gone wrong between the recommendation and the award. Something happened between his commanders deciding he should get the Distinguished Service Cross and be upgraded to the Medal of Honor, Hervieux explained. But we don't know what because those records are no longer there. But Waverly Woodson's heroics on Omaha Beach were clearly ignored and forgotten because the Army was racist to its core. Captain Kevin Braflat, First Army historian, made it his mission to find the truth. He combed through an estimated 415 feet of Army records. Hundreds of hours of research. Dusty boxes, forgotten files, fragmented documentation. He was convinced that Woodson had been nominated for the Medal of Honor at the time. 100% convinced. In October 2023, 80 years after D-Day, the Army held a ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery. Joann Woodson, 90 years old, sat surrounded by generations of her family. Many wore T-shirts with Waverly's photo and the words, 1944 D-Day U.S. Army Medic. Steve Woodson, their son, told the crowd, "It's been a long, long road to get to this day. My father, if he could have been here today, would have been humbled." The Army presented Joann with her husband's Bronze Star and Combat Medic Badge, honors he should have received decades earlier. Better late than never, but still late. Still not enough. Senator Van Hollen spoke at the ceremony. "It's pretty clear that had he been a white soldier, he would have received the Medal of Honor, and the only thing that has stood in the way is the color of his skin." In June 2024, the Army announced that Waverly Woodson would receive the Distinguished Service Cross, posthumously, 80 years after D-Day, the second highest military honor, the highest award the Army can bestow on its own authority. On June 6, 2024, the 80th anniversary of D-Day, First Army soldiers carried a World War II-era Distinguished Service Cross to Omaha Beach. They held a ceremony at the spot where Woodson had landed, where he had set up his aid station, where he had saved 200 lives. They laid the medal in the sand. Major General William A. Ryan III, Commanding General of First Army, explained, "We want to be able to tell Mrs. Woodson that the medal she is receiving on behalf of her beloved husband has actually been to Normandy, has actually been to the very place he performed his truly remarkable actions. In September 2024, Joann Woodson, 95 years old, received the Distinguished Service Cross at a ceremony on Capitol Hill. Her husband's name was finally, officially, recognized as a hero. 80 years late, but recognized. The Medal of Honor? Still denied. The Army maintains there isn't enough documentation. The 1973 fire destroyed the records. Without primary source material, they can't move forward. The fact that white Medal of Honor recipients have received the award with less documentation doesn't seem to matter. The fact that the Army's own memo proves Woodson was nominated doesn't seem to matter. The fact that 200 men lived because of his actions doesn't seem to matter. Joann Woodson and Senator Van Hollen continue to fight for the Medal of Honor. They believe that Woodson earned it, that he deserves it, that America owes it to him. The fight continues. Here's what we know for certain. On June 6, 1944, Waverly Woodson saved approximately 200 lives on Omaha Beach, 5 to 7% of all American casualties that day. He worked for 30 hours straight while wounded. He performed an amputation under fire. He resuscitated drowning men. He set broken bones, removed bullets, dispensed plasma, and refused to stop until his body collapsed. His commander recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross. A general's office upgraded that to the Medal of Honor. A War Department memo confirms this. The recommendation was strong enough that FDR himself was supposed to present it personally, and then it disappeared. Lost in the machinery of a racist military that couldn't stomach the idea of a black man receiving America's highest honor. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion has been written out of history. Most books about D-Day don't mention them. The movies don't show them. In Saving Private Ryan, you can see their balloons floating in the background, but there are no black soldiers depicted. History erased them while they were still alive. There were no black soldiers on D-Day, people told Linda Hervieux repeatedly while she researched her book. But that's a lie. By the end of June 6th, nearly 2,000 African-American troops had landed on the beaches of Normandy. Most were assigned to service and supply battalions, doing the labor the Army relegated to black soldiers. But the 320th was different. The 320th was combat. The 320th was first wave. The 320th was there, and nobody remembers. Waverly Woodson died believing that what he'd done was simply his duty. He never sought glory, never demanded recognition, never made his heroism public. When people asked him about D-Day, he deflected, changed the subject, talked about other things. "There is no hero," he told ABC News in 1994. "It's just that you're there and you do what you can do." But there was a hero. On Omaha Beach, on the bloodiest stretch of coastline in the D-Day invasion, among the screaming wounded and the dying, one medic with shrapnel in his body and determination in his heart saved 200 lives. That medic was black. That mattered to the Army in 1944. It mattered enough to deny him the Medal of Honor. It mattered enough to forget his name. It mattered enough to erase his battalion from history. It shouldn't have mattered. Heroism has no color. Valor has no race. Courage doesn't check skin tone before it acts. But America in 1944 couldn't see past the surface, couldn't recognize that a black medic from Philadelphia deserved the same honor as a white soldier doing the same thing. In 2024, 80 years later, America still hasn't fully recognized Waverly Woodson. The Distinguished Service Cross is significant. It's the second highest honor. It's more than most soldiers will ever receive. But it's not what he earned. It's not what he was recommended for. It's not what he deserves. Joann Woodson, at 95 years old, continues to fight. "I will fight for him as long as I live," she has said. She wants the Medal of Honor, not for herself, not for fame, for justice, for acknowledgement that her husband was a hero who saved 200 American lives on the most important day of World War II. Senator Chris Van Hollen continues to push the Army. Captain Kevin Braflett continues to search through archives, hoping to find one more document, one more piece of evidence that will tip the scales. The effort continues, but it shouldn't take this long. It shouldn't require a 95-year-old widow fighting for decades. It shouldn't need journalists writing books and historians searching through 415 feet of records. It should have been automatic in 1944. Waverly Woodson saved 200 lives on D-Day. That should be enough. But in America, in 1944, nothing a black soldier did was ever enough. The 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion served for 140 days in France. They protected the beaches. They followed the advance. They did their job with courage and determination. General Eisenhower said so himself. And then history forgot them. When you think of D-Day, you think of the iconic images: landing craft hitting the beach, soldiers wading through the surf, the cliffs of Normandy, the sacrifice of the greatest generation. You think of the movies, The Longest Day, Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers. You don't think of the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. You don't think of the black soldiers who were there. You don't think of Waverly Woodson. That's the problem. The conventional wisdom of D-Day, as Linda Hervieux noted, is that there were no black soldiers who landed on those beaches, but the truth is that there were almost 2,000 black soldiers who landed by the end of June 6, 1944. They served, they fought, they died, they saved lives. And we forgot them. Waverly Woodson. Remember the name? The medic who saved 200 lives while wounded. The soldier recommended for the Medal of Honor. The hero denied recognition because of his skin color. The man whose records were destroyed in a fire. The veteran who died without receiving what he earned. The husband whose widow fights for justice at 95 years old. Remember the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only all-black combat unit on D-Day. The soldiers who deployed balloons under fire. The men who protected the beaches. The unit written out of history. Remember what America did. How it treated its black soldiers. How it denied them recognition. How it erased them from the story. How, 80 years later, it still hasn't fully made it right. Give respect before you expect it. Treat people the way you want to be treated. Remember the mission. Set the example. Keep going. That was Vernon Baker's creed. Another black hero denied the Medal of Honor for 52 years. It could have been Waverly Woodson's too. Both men kept going. Through racism, through denial, through erasure. They kept going because that's what soldiers do. But we should have done better. We should have recognized them when it mattered. We should have honored them when they were alive to receive it. We should have taught their stories to every child learning about D-Day. We didn't. That's on us. All of us. Everyone who learned about D-Day and never heard of the 320th. Everyone who watched the movies and didn't notice the absence of black soldiers. Everyone who assumed that the greatest generation was exclusively white. Waverly Woodson saved 200 lives on D-Day. 80 years later, he still hasn't received the Medal of Honor. The black hero you don't remember deserves better than this.